Moving straight on to our next session. Brent Wanner is a senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency, or IEA, and lead of power generation analysis within the World Energy Outlook team. With a background in economics, Brent's area of expertise include energy and climate policy analysis, economics of power generation technologies, and electricity market designs, to just name a few. He will be presenting the IEA's pathway to net zero by 2050. Thank you very much for joining me, Brent.
Thank you, Greta. Thanks for having me.
And this is our last session for the day. So Brent will be now presenting a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. The floor is yours, Brent.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks for the opportunity to follow up on all the very interesting conversations going on and the keynotes that preceded me. So I'd be happy to share my screen and share a few slides, also to highlight some of the key elements of the Net Zero by 2050 report that we recently released. Let me share my screen here. This was first is most important, I think, is to understand that the Net Zero by 2050 report, which we released now just over a month ago, was motivated mainly by the actions that we're seeing from governments and from companies and investors of having them set their own targets to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in many cases, and certainly centering on 2050. We now have over 40 countries that have committed to reaching net zero emissions, many companies as well. And in total, the coverage of those commitments is around 70% of global GDP and global CO2 emissions. That left, we felt the need for a clear roadmap for the global energy sector on what it actually means to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So in my remarks, I'll focus on the overall picture, but also drill down into the elements for decarbonizing electricity and the central role that plays. I had the good fortune to be part of the team and one of the lead authors for the report. I generally look after, as mentioned, thank you, Greta, for the introduction, look after the electricity analysis and outlook for the World Energy Outlook, and have done so for several years now. And of course, part of the thinking for the report as well is that this is a contribution to COP26. In fact, it was at the request of the COP26 presidency to look into this as well. So translating those overall targets into a roadmap, because actually on the ground, we see that there are many of these policies are not yet in place. Only about 1/4 of those commitments are actually underpinned by clear policy targets and clear plans. So if we go forward, I think let me start by actually giving a bit of perspective on our net zero scenario, which we shorthand here for net NZE, where it sits within some of the IPCC scenarios that are also that reach net zero. So first, we have to say that our pathway is a pathway to net zero, not the pathway. We recognize there are uncertainties, there are different ways to get there. And of course, the IPCC scenarios lay those out with many scenarios. There are over 90 scenarios that were included in the IPCC scenario work to 1.5 degrees that were classified as having at least a 50% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees by 2100, but only 18 of those actually reach net zero CO2 emissions for the energy sector and industrial processes. And that's the key aspect of our work, is that by having this ultimate goal of reaching net zero emissions for energy and industrial processes, it actually is one of the most aggressive scenarios and most ambitious scenarios that has been laid out in a comprehensive way. Even the low energy demand scenario from the IPCC that was used as an illustrative model pathway in the summary for policymakers has significantly less emission reductions than in our net zero pathway. So there's no simple way to compare these complex scenarios, but to highlight a few points or a few technologies where we are actually at the lower end compared to those 18 scenarios that have a similar ultimate objective. We actually see that on some of these key aspects, we are at the very low end. We're talking about carbon dioxide capture and removal. Both of those factors in the top left here, you see that our scenario is at either the lowest or second lowest of the range. This is also true for bioenergy. A lot has been made about the sustainable supply of bioenergy, and we worked also closely with EASA on this to understand the available sustainable bioenergy supply for energy without impacting agriculture, so food supplies, or also forestry. So here you see we're at the very low end on the use of bioenergy in achieving these ambitions. In terms of fossil fuels, we actually have, the IPCC scenarios have over 150 exajoules of fossil fuels in 2050. We are below that, well below that at 120 exajoules. Hydrogen is actually one of the areas that we have relatively high amounts of use compared to the IPCC scenarios, with over 30 exajoules in 2050 compared to a median of about 18 in those 18 scenarios again, which of course are now several years old, and so did not have the chance to take on board the high levels of momentum at the political level that we're currently seeing for hydrogen production and use globally. So already that gives a sense of perspective relative to other scenarios, but to show a bit more of the kind of detail here, we are talking about a very ambitious reduction for global energy-related emissions shown here. Split by sector, by 2030, we already need to reduce global energy and process emissions by about 40% to stay on track to reaching net zero emissions and ultimately heading towards zero in 2050. Now here you can also see that electricity is in fact the largest emitting sector today, but is also the first sector to reach net zero emissions in our pathway by 2040. So that really gives electricity kind of a starring role and makes it a cornerstone very much of the transitions. And in this report, so in many ways we have this long-term ambition. The reductions already need to start very soon, but we wanted to make sure that that was very clear that we actually need to take clear steps along the way. And those milestones already start today, this year in 2021. We need to take actions. There needs to be checkpoints along the way to make sure that we're actually on this path. So in the power sector, we need to make sure that we're not building new unabated coal-fired power plants where they're not needed. We need to scale up the growth of wind and solar PV in particular. And ultimately, we need to reach net zero emissions in the power sector by 2040 and already in advanced economies in the 2030s. Now here you have milestones for other sectors as well. I won't go through each one, but in total in the report, we lay out over 400 individual milestones by sector at the global level to follow the pathway towards net zero emissions by 2050, because ultimately we want this to be an orderly transition and very importantly, an affordable transition. So we need to do this step by step along the way. There's no waiting here. There's no opportunity to wait. And I think that's also been highlighted by speakers today preceding me, that this is an urgent requirement, an urgent call to action in all sectors, but also at all levels, by government, but also companies, investors, and down to citizens as well. So if we highlight in particular, sort of, if we move through the stages of how do we actually want to get there, very clearly the 2020s need to be an action-based decade. We need to make it a decade of clean energy expansion. Solar PV and wind in the electricity sector are absolutely the cornerstones. They are here They are ready for growth. They are competitive in most markets. In fact, the lowest cost, the cheapest sources of new electricity in most markets today, but we need to quadruple the level of annual deployment over the next decade. So 2020 was a record year. We added almost 240 gigawatts of wind and solar. That needs to rise to 1,000 gigawatts just in the year 2030 alone. So that is a massive task in front of us. And clearly we cannot wake up in 2030 and accomplish that. That needs to take steps every year from now till 2030 to achieve that. It needs to be a world action, and to give a sense there that that scale is obviously picking up the level of investment quite significantly. We also need electric cars to become the norm. In terms of electric car sales, we need to increase that many, many times here, surpassing 50 million vehicles sold in 2030 already. So these markets that are stepping forward, this needs to become the dominant new cars that everyone is purchasing. We've only seen for these two already, we're talking about moving also beyond the levels of experience we have in any markets today. So for wind and solar, we need to already be reaching 40% of generation from those in 2030, where only 2 countries in the world today are at that level. For electric car sales, we need to reach about 60% of sales in 2030. We've only passed 50% in Norway and Iceland as of today. So we are moving at continental world scale to where the most advanced markets are today. We also need to focus on energy efficiency. The most secure and affordable unit of energy is the one we don't consume, actually. We need to double the pace of energy intensity improvement for the global economy, so about 4% per year reductions as compared to 2% in recent years. We combine these already give you the sense of sort of 3 key pillars of how to get there. Renewable energy, expanding that as fast as we can go. Electrifying uses, so transport here, but also heating and energy efficiency. These are 3 of the core pillars of the pathway. In order to do this, one of the key elements is then we need to scale up clean energy investment. So in the last 5 years, the amount of investment going into clean energy has increased dramatically and is now well over $1 trillion per year. But we need to move that up to over $4 trillion per year by 2030. That needs to be going into not only electricity generation, so mainly renewables there, but also the underlying infrastructure to connect electric vehicles, to produce hydrogen, to transport hydrogen as well. But clearly on the end use side, this is a major step up in overall spending and overall investment, where that's going to come from a variety of sources, but it's mainly coming from private sources, mobilized by public policies that create these incentives, that set appropriate frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and reform energy taxes. We'll also need direct government financing to boost the infrastructure build out and the number of projects and pace of expansion there. So all of this actually has a win-win in the fact that it also boosts global economic growth. This is a scenario where we have very strong economic growth overall, 40% economic growth, so 40% expansion of the world economy to 2030, 150% growth to 2050, where there's 2 billion more people in the world in 2050 than there are in 2020 in this scenario. And this boost for clean energy investment actually helps further that economic growth. In a joint analysis with the International Monetary Fund, we assessed that this boost in clean energy investment would actually increase the global economy by 0.4% per year over the next decade. It's the equivalent of adding the size of the Japanese economy over the next decade, on top of the otherwise expected recovery from the COVID-19 crisis that we face today. Of course, we need to recognize that the economic impacts would also vary quite widely across regions, particularly those that depend on fossil fuels for income, would need to diversify their economies and move to accelerate any efforts to reform inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But that 10-year phase, so after the next 10 years, we have most of the technologies for that. I mentioned renewables, electrification, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, but we need to also prepare for what comes after that. In the period after 2030, we will very much depend on innovation in many sectors. We don't actually have all the technologies we need in the market today. We know what those technologies would largely be, and most of them are under development. But we need to actually push those and make those available in the market in order to be able to achieve this pathway, in order to continue moving forward. So when we look at 2050, the overall emission reductions, almost half of those come from the technologies that aren't yet in the market today. And I stress that these are in prototype stage or demonstration stages, rather than sort of technologies that don't yet exist. A few of those technologies that would fall into this category, and of course the report lays these out in more detail, but to mention a few, advanced battery designs can make particularly improving the energy density can have a large impact then in heavy duty trucks, also in aviation, and these are at the prototype stage today. We would also need carbon capture, utilization, and storage in the cement industry. We need to prove carbon removal technologies, so direct air capture there and bioenergy with carbon capture. Scaling up electrolyzers for hydrogen production is another key area. And ultimately, this pace of innovation that we'll need on a net zero pathway is much more rapid than what we've ever seen in the past, about twice as fast in terms of time to market than we've ever seen. So for governments, two of the key tasks there are boosting the demonstration funding and also reprioritizing the R&D funding. So we can have this shock to the system, the surge of demonstration projects that helps bring these technologies to market. So then for my remaining time, excuse me, I would like to focus to drill down a bit on the electricity side. As mentioned, it's the cornerstone really of the reductions in our net zero pathway. And one of those key aspects is electrification, but needing to decarbonize and reach net zero emissions in the power sector by 2040. At the same time, you've got to meet demand that's doubling over the next 20 years and increasing 2.5 times from today to 2050. So that's faster growth than what we've seen at the world level in recent years, but also more widespread. This is in advanced economies and developing economies. So one of the key aspects there is, one thing we need to do to change very much is how we actually meet that demand growth. In the past, fossil fuels without carbon capture, utilization, and storage was a primary means of meeting demand growth. And up until 2019, this has been rising at the global level. Even though the share had been starting to decline because of growth of wind and solar, we hadn't actually seen an absolute reduction, a sizable reduction, until 2020. And so we need to build on that and drive a more structural decline for coal-fired generation without carbon capture and storage, but also natural gas-fired generation, and of course, oil. We'll have a suite of low-emission technologies available to us. We already have in the market today, and in many systems, nuclear power. We have hydrogen-based fuels are starting to become kind of a focal area for many countries, not only in the power sector, but in other sectors that are hard to abate, but to provide then a way to, it also provides a way to use existing assets. So existing coal and gas-fired generation can be converted to use hydrogen-based fuels, and that's a part of the long term, as well as retrofitting with carbon capture and storage. But you see there's a yawning gap between overall demand and overall generation and where we get with these sources which of course is renewables, becomes the primary means of providing electricity in the world as we go forward. Today, we're less than 30% of generation from renewable sources. In 2050, we're looking at 90%. Solar PV drives this growth, and it's a complete change in the overall system. From 10% of generation today for wind and solar to 40% in 2030, which is about the limits of the horizon of our experience already, and then going much, much further to 70% of generation in 2050, which changes the face of electricity and the nature of electricity supply and security. To kind of underscore that point here even more, the kind of growth we're talking about for solar PV and wind is absolutely massive and should not be taken for granted here. We are sitting in 2020, and in these curves, you can see we are really getting going. We're just building the momentum, in effect, really moving away from zero here. And it's a call that we need to redouble those efforts. As mentioned, we need to quadruple the deployment of wind and solar over the next decade and keep going and keep expanding wind and solar until we reach the decarbonization targets in the 2030s and 2040. So to do this, of course, the technologies are ready. We know utility scale solar PV is here, extremely cheap. On the wind side, we have onshore wind, but also offshore wind is becoming more cost competitive every year and is set to expand well beyond Europe into China and many other markets. And so we see that a diverse set of renewable technologies is also an important part of the mix here. We're talking about a 20-fold increase for solar PV and 11-fold increase for wind. I mentioned the phase out of coal-fired generation. To underscore that, we're talking about a huge part of the system today. The largest source of electricity generation is coal today, and we need to drive that effectively to zero. We need to phase out the most inefficient over the next decade, that's subcritical coal-fired power plants, and move to phase out all unabated coal by 2040. We can convert many of the 2,100 gigawatts of coal to use other fuels. We have a multifaceted approach to make sure that these coal assets can contribute to the transition. They can be, the emissions are really the target here, not necessarily just the terawatt hours. So they can provide flexibility. We can repurpose them to run less and to provide this flexibility. Can retrofit them with carbon capture and storage or to co-fire ammonia, in fact. So but to give the sense of scale here, this is a very steep drop and is much faster than all of the announced pledges that we've seen so far, which are substantial and would look to cut coal-fired generation by about 60% from now to 2050, but we need to cut that by 100% by 2040. And it's often a bit forgotten in the discussions, but we wanted to make sure it's raised on the agenda here, is the importance of investment in electricity networks. This has been generally below $300 billion per year going into electricity networks. That's local distribution and also large-scale transmission. And this needs to scale up as well. This needs to triple over the next decade and keep rising to about $1 trillion per year. And that's for a number of reasons. That's to meet all this increasing electricity demand that we showed earlier from electrification, but also to connect and integrate the growing share of renewable sources. Wind and solar tend to be a bit further from the grid than traditional sources of electricity, and we need to integrate those fully and make the best use of those investments while also replacing and upgrading the grids we have. So ultimately, this point of generation supported by networks are two pieces of the puzzle. A third, very much, and linked to energy security, is on flexibility. With such a high share of wind and solar generation that are variable depending on available weather resources, so sun and wind, we then need to shift our thinking in electricity that the main way to maintain electricity security is to have a flexible set of power generators in the system to be able to match not only changes in demand, but also match changes in availability for wind and solar. So having one picture of what this means for flexibility, if we look at kind of hour-to-hour basis in our assessment, we need to realize that we're shifting away from fossil fuels, which provide most of this flexibility now. Those are going to be phased out. So what we rely on heavily today for flexibility shifts is more or less disappears by 2050. We need to rely very much on renewables, on new storage technologies, but also on demand-side response. Having demand be an integrated part of planning, but of system operations, that consumers, large and small, need to be a part of that system in order to make sure that it's affordable and reliable. So by 2050, in all regions around the world, we're talking about more than half of flexibility on an hour-to-hour basis coming from energy storage, shown here as batteries, and demand response, which today are just a very small part of the overall flexibility package. That's to keep the lights on, that's to help make sure it's affordable, and also to make sure that the investment we do need to take, which is sizable, is also efficient and is the minimal amount of investment we can in order to achieve our overall objectives for the net zero pathway. So with that, I would close. Hopefully that gives you a sense. Obviously, it's a few of the key pillars and highlights from our net zero by 2050, a global roadmap for the energy sector. And very happy to move to the Q&A. Thanks very much, Greta.
Thank you, Brent, for that really clear and comprehensive overview of the IEA's net zero pathway. Really interesting and a lot of information there that we can definitely take away with us. So when assessing what needs to be done to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's of course many variables that we need to be taken into account and many different ways of calculating how this translates into targets or CO2 budgets. What sort of processes do you use in power sector modelling to achieve these figures and expected outcomes, and how accurate are they?
Absolutely. I think this is a key question that underpins kind of our work and something we actually think a lot about. And I mean, a few aspects I would highlight is that first, any long-term outlook or any sort of work of this nature relies on having 2 feet firmly on the ground in today's data, in the best up to the minute, up to the year at least, data of where we stand in the power system, but also for the overall energy sector. There's a lot of momentum in the systems today. We have built a lot of new power plants in the last years, and understanding how that impacts the future is an essential starting point and is a major part of the IEA's work. A very large portion of our overall size is actually devoted to data collection, and we integrate that fully. A second aspect is certainly policy tracking. So having our ears to the ground and following very closely recent announcements and digging into the details of what that means. But you need to then obviously go beyond that, and we engage very much with individual countries, leading energy companies as well, to understand the thinking behind their plans, more of the details there, and sort of how that thinking is shifting. And that reveals many things like technology preferences, also what is feasible in a pathway like this. Obviously, it's scaling up many elements across the energy sector, clean energy elements, some of which are more ready than others. So how do you balance that? That's something well beyond what a model can see, but is something that's very important to have this engagement, continual engagement with not only our member countries, but also our association member countries and all part of the IEA family, which today represents more than 80% of global energy use.
And the IEA report states that all technologies needed to achieve the necessary deep cuts in global emissions by 2030 already exist. And you actually included this in your presentation as well. And then you later mentioned that, some of them are under development and they're not in the market yet. But what do you think are the main barriers for the widespread deployment of these technologies, and how can we overcome them?
Absolutely. So I think, the issue we have is a bit of scale. I would say that so it's kind of breadth or depth. We see that wind and solar are being deployed in many countries, most countries around the world. So at last check, there were over 130 countries with policies supporting wind and solar PV. So we're clearly seeing that there is a widespread support if we think about renewables. Energy efficiency is very much the same, but the depth and scale of deployment, I think, is what we're not currently on track for. If we're thinking about moving to a net zero by 2050 pathway, every region needs to scale up those ambitions and the implementation measures to get there. So we see very few points in our policy tracking work or just our general energy tracking work is that very few countries and very few technologies are actually on this pathway at the scale needed. So that clearly means that raising ambition is one very important aspect, but is only half of the equation. Actually putting in place the implementation measures. So if we focus on renewables for a moment, this is the kind of thing of having tenders in place to actually deploy enough wind and solar into the systems. This is having renewable energy standards that require certain shares. So mandates, regulations, and policies that give clear signals of the long-term vision, but also these clear steps that investors and companies can take clear action based on.
Mm-hmm. And looking at a timescale of 10 to 30 years and thinking about mitigating the effects of global warming by a minute degree can often seem like a really monumental and quite abstract task. The IEA obviously does a really good job of breaking these down into key priority actions, as we've seen in the report. But for you, what do you think are the key takeaways of the report, particularly for individuals, consumers, and companies that they can start doing right now?
Yes, as you said, I mean, laying out 2050 can feel a long time away. 30 years away can make it feel that the problem is not here. What we hope to achieve with the milestones is exactly as you said, that we need to take actions all along the way and really starting yesterday if we could have, but certainly today. And as mentioned, that's by all kind of levels or all groups, from governments to companies to investors to individuals. For companies, I think this is clear. They, in many ways, in many places, they're leading by example in terms of their planning, whether to get to net zero emissions themselves or to drive some of these, even the policy objectives, whether that's carbon pricing or just the use of renewables. But we need to see that as a more comprehensive action. Companies need to be fully engaged in that with their own planning, consistent with the kind of milestones that we laid out here. I think even the most ambitious target setting we see is often short or a bit delayed from these ambitions that we laid out of kind of the steps along the way. Consumers, I think, for me personally, actually being as a consumer myself, of course, I found the report and the analysis quite motivating that we can have a big role as consumers. Behavioral change is an enabler to ultimately reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We can help open the door and keep the door open to this target longer. All of the millions of little decisions we take every day, whether we walk to work, bike to work, or work remotely now, in most cases, or do we replace a gas heating system with electricity? All of these are incremental steps that drive towards this long-term goal. So for me, it's the message to consumers is all about sort of changing the mindset that you have a central role and that each of those decisions that's consistent with this pathway is certainly a step in the right direction. And as consumers, when we take millions of those steps, these small actions can lead to large changes.
Absolutely. And as you just mentioned, with things like remote working and less flying, less transport over the last year and few months, people have really changed their behaviour with the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think we can take away from this to realise how much we can impact things and, we can keep that momentum going?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all experienced this in different ways, and I think we've all experienced some of the challenges. But at the same time, it's shown how resilient people are to really massive changes in their normal daily lives. We've seen certainly the way we work, the way we go to school and education have changed almost overnight. And there's many success stories here. And I think it offers a chance to rethink maybe what the boundaries were, how much people are willing to change. Also, organizations, there are new ways of working that we've proven over the last year that may have been slower to arrive, but offer sort of open new doors in order to make those changes more permanent in a way that's consistent with this kind of pathway.
Mm-hmm. And as we've mentioned before, you're one of the lead authors of the IEA's World Energy Outlook, which was last published in October 2020. Can you give us any insights into how far we've come since then, and how it's looking for 2021?
So it is very much a work in progress. I will return to it after this discussion, and many late nights ahead of us for the World Energy Outlook 2021, which we look forward to because there is a lot of action going on. As one of its key elements of the work is to track exactly the trajectory that we're on and compare it to the path that we want to be on. And we are seeing a lot of movement in the right direction. We're seeing, certainly in the year of COP26, we're seeing ambitions being raised by a number of countries, which is very good. We are not necessarily yet seeing the implementation measures being put in place, the kind of on-the-ground policies and regulations that underpin that, which also follows, generally have the ambition first and then these implementation measures. So we're tracking both of those very closely, and we'll report those and assess those kind of systematically through the World Energy Outlook 2021, but certainly a step in the right direction in many large economies. One step of many to be taken, I think, though, is the clear message we're seeing to close the gap to this to a pathway that leads to net zero emissions by 2050.
And at the end of your presentation, you talked about the importance of digital grids, smart grids, which is often forgotten. How important are they? What role do you think they'll play in the future, and how can we ensure that people don't forget about them?
Absolutely. And it's even in the scale of investment, it's often forgotten, even though today we spend about 40% of investment generally goes towards electricity networks. It's often and is generally even larger than renewables or at the same scale. But we often don't hear it because of the way it's that return on investment is organized. The need to digitalize and make grids smarter is central to that flexibility in the future. I mentioned demand-side response would be a huge part of the overall flexibility package. That is in large part enabled by smart and digital grids, being able to have more communication throughout the grids, being able to make sure that the exchange of power is as efficient as possible, and also that we can have the control of larger regions, but also down to incorporating decentralized sources in the most efficient way. Because I think part of an affordable and orderly path is putting all these various pieces together. And in electricity, you have all scales, down to the household, down to extremely large power plants and offshore wind farms, which are at the very high end. And putting all those pieces together in the most efficient way is key to keeping things affordable when we're changing the system this much. So accommodating those flexibility measures is completely reliant on a fully functioning, robust grid that's also resilient to cyber attacks or cyber threats, as well as any climate impacts that we might see. So I think none of these pieces can be taken out of the puzzle in order for us to get there.
And one of our major goals here at the gridXdays is to encourage dialogue and collaboration between different players in the energy industry to, ensure that we achieve carbon neutrality. How do you think we can continue this dialogue and make sure that all voices are heard?
I think the first step is the dialogue you're having, I think, is absolutely commendable, and exactly what we need to do is to make sure that we are engaged at all levels here. Certainly the IEA, we see our main task is to engage with policymakers, but increasingly it's to engage also with companies, investors, and consumers. So in very much the same way that there are many roles for each of these groups, and we need to make sure everyone is moving in the same direction. So understanding the urgency, I think, as you've laid out today, even in the agenda, understanding the urgency is essential. Understanding that everyone has a role is essential, and understanding what that can be. We need some kind of vision of how each of these groups can contribute, as a lowly individual to someone who helps inform policymakers. There are many roles to be played, and we need to kind of think of this as one coherent set of actions leading to a set of goals that we all would benefit from.
And we're almost running out of time. Do you have any parting words or key takeaways for viewers today of what they can learn from, or how they can change their actions?
I think just being conscious of, that's a very difficult one, of being conscious of how your individual choices can have an impact in the long run. We're all driving many of these trends at the global level, and energy are the accumulation of individual actions. Oil demand at the global level, transportation is a huge part of that, which of course is the result of all of our choices. How much we use coal in the system today is also a part of the past choices, but it's something that we can then affect. So being active, being supportive of these longer term ambitions, and asking yourself what you can do to help contribute that, whether it's within your own household, in your community, or in your country.
Thank you so much for imparting such wisdom and, really interesting facts and figures. I think we've all learnt a lot today, and it was really great having you on board. And just to check as well, the World Energy Outlook will be published in October this year. Is that correct?
We are planning, yes, to release. The final date hasn't been yet decided, but we're looking at October ahead of COP26. Yes.
Great. Well, we look forward to that.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our first gridXdays conference. So we've heard from a lot of speakers. We had a very interesting panel discussion, seen some really insightful presentations. Thank you so much to all the speakers that joined us today. And also thank you for everyone who tuned in and provided some questions. It's really nice to get some different perspectives there from everyone from around the world. Tomorrow we'll be kicking off again bright and early at 9 a.m. Central European time and going right through until 5:45 p.m. We have a whole range of speakers in line for tomorrow. If you haven't checked out the program, be sure to check it out. It's on the website that you're probably already on now, gridX.ai/X. So we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.